Sebastian Ibanez, a native of Mesa, Arizona, was trying to be a good citizen by voting. In 2018, he wanted to participate in the midterm elections, but was turned away by his first and second polling places because the voting machines wouldn't work for him. The third, after hours of searching, was an overdue success. He told the Arizona Central of November 6th that same year, "It's annoying to know that you aren't able to exercise your rights because you're blind." Annoying doesn't go far enough. It's unconstitutional. Sebastian's experience is described by the Center for American Progress of May 19th, 2020. During the 2016 and 2018 elections, over 60% of polling places were inaccessible to disabled voters. And this lack of accessible voting will only be worse as COVID-19 continues to loom. However, Truth Out of May 12, 2020 argues, there is no better time to address this electoral shortchange than right now, because the COVID-19 pandemic is demonstrating just how inaccessible traditional voting is. But here's the thing. The pandemic only crystallizes the structural obstacles that have disenfranchised disabled voters for decades. Considering the ACLU of July 20th, 2020 estimates 35 million plus eligible voters with disabilities continue to face barriers to voting despite laws that were supposed to fix this very issue. Action must be taken that gives all Americans, regardless of ability status, the chance to exercise their right to vote. So today, we will first examine how voters have been systematically disenfranchised. Second, delve into why this disenfranchisement is ongoing, before finally proposing some suggestions to fix our elections so that we might finally make advancements on what the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund calls the last front in the voting rights movement. Prior to the Revolutionary War, voting was cast through voice. Once the nation grew, we turned to private paper ballots in the 1890s. Little has changed since. The lack of innovation continues to be problematic for two reasons. We are still reliant on paper ballots, and polling places and machines are inaccessible. First, we are still reliant on paper balloting. Lou Ann Blake at the National Federation of the Blind explains, paper ballots are difficult for people with visual impairments to fill out privately, and those who have motor impairment issues, like Parkinson's, can also find difficulty with dexterity. Many states have opted to increase mail-in voting as a potential solution. But voting by mail must be accompanied with in-person voting for disabled voters who cannot fill out a ballot privately. Take Dr. Regina Root, a professor at the College of William and Mary, who needed her husband to vote for her because a visual impairment meant she couldn't read or fill out her ballot at home. She told the Washington Post on August 31st, 2020, "I love my husband, but for as much as I've studied, casting a vote independently is really important." Second, USA Today of July 26, 2020 laments, during the 2016 election, 60% of polling places had at least one barrier to access the location, and a measly 17% were fully accessible. While this includes a lack of ramps, it also includes lesser-known accessibility impediments to those with visual and hearing impairments. It's not just about whether they can vote, but as Forbes of July 6, 2020 argues, the quality and dignity of their voting experience must be safeguarded too. One person, one vote is a central doctrine of this nation. But we've done little to make sure that everyone can actually get to the ballot box. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 30 years ago and was hailed as revolutionary. But as any 30-year-old will tell you, 30 years means you're old. The ADA is promising, but hasn't overcome two key continued obstacles to accessible voting: security concerns, and accessibility is demonized as unnecessary. First, the overemphasis on security. The Washington Post of March 3rd, 2020 informs that the US actually makes virtual voting possible for Americans overseas and military personnel. However, this system, which is far more accessible, is dismissed as a security threat if it were implemented nationally. Dr. Juan Gilbert, an expert on election technology at the University of Florida, disagrees. You've actually weakened the security of an election by segregating voters, Gilbert said. It's very important to have universally designed tech for not only access, but security. Access and security are not mutually exclusive. Ultimately, the virtue of our election system is not merely that it is secure, but that it is open to everyone who chooses to vote. Second, accessibility is deemed unnecessary. The Washington Post detailed a plan by the NAACP and civil rights and disability groups calling for $3.6 billion to be allocated by Congress to assist with COVID and accessibility issues. For comparison, last year Americans spent over $4 billion playing fantasy football. Nonetheless, calls for funds are routinely disregarded as unnecessary. Even with recent rounds of COVID relief bills, Senator Chuck Schumer has shown a willingness to overlook voting access in favor of other priorities. While according to the WTOP News of August 14, 2020, the White House has declared calls for election support a fundamentally unserious ask. So here we are, with millions of voters with disabilities and decades of accumulated frustration, still demanding that their voting rights be taken seriously. Americans with disabilities comprise the largest minority group in the nation. The collective voting power of this demographic alone is enough to reshape American politics. We need to make it possible for them to do so by getting to the ballot box. First, let's take the long view. Digital voting is the accessible future. Already, mobile apps like Votes are trying to implement voting strictly from your smartphone. If we can do forensics online, then surely we can vote online. However, the New York Times of February 13th, 2020 warns that the tech is by no means perfect. However, as it continues to improve, we are able to make not only apps, but bring voting into the 21st century. Currently, Votes can create a paper trail that allows auditors to verify the security of an election. And states like West Virginia, Oregon, and Utah have agreed to pilot them in their state elections. I have demo videos of how such an app would work posted in the description below. But our democracy is under assault. We need to act now. In the short term, we need committed disability advocates at polling places. This year, there is a shortage of poll workers. Most poll workers are over 60 years old and the most at risk for COVID-19. This means that 500,000 new volunteers might be needed to keep the polls open. Power the Polls is an initiative led by Fair Election Center, a nonpartisan voting rights organization dedicated to accessible voting. At their website, you can sign up to staff at your local polling place. There, we can get training necessary to ask proper accommodation questions, ensure all equipment is working properly, and I can give you needed information to pass along to voters to make polling sites more accessible. This includes state-specific legislation, practical tips, and public transportation options to get to polls. This isn't going to be easy. But then again, neither is democracy. And like democracy, accessibility only works when we work together. Today, we examined how disabled voters have been systematically disenfranchised, why it continues, and some short and long-term solutions. Sebastian Ibanez tried to vote at 3 separate locations before he was finally successful. If every citizen were as committed as him, this problem would not exist in the first place.